Hatchet Chapter 2. This is marked as page 6 for you at the bottom. For those of you that are in Spellhouse right now, make sure that you are filling out your graphic organizer and pausing this video as you need to. Remember, we left off in Chapter 1 with the pilot just had a heart attack and is either dead or in a coma. Brian is alone on the plane. What is he going to do? For a time that he could not understand, Brian could do nothing. Even after his mind began working and he could see what had happened, he could do nothing. It was as if his hands and arms were lead. Lead, that means like they were really heavy. Then he looked for ways for it to not have happened. Be asleep, his mind screamed at the pilot. Just be asleep and your eyes will open now and your hands will take the controls and your feet will move to the pedals. But it did not happen. The pilot did not move except that his head rolled on a neck impossibly loose as the plane hit a small bit of turbulence. Turbulence is like when you're flying and there's a bump in the air. The plane. Somehow the plane was still flying. Seconds had passed, nearly a minute, and the plane flew on as if nothing had happened. And he had to do something. But he did not know what. Help. He had to help. Also, quick pause. Notice that there's repetition right here. He had to do something. Help. Gary Paulson is using repetition to show us that these two things are really important. He has to do something and has to help. He stretched one arm toward the pilot, saw that his fingers were trembling, and touched the pilot on the chest. He did not know what to do. He knew there were procedures, that you could do mouth-to-mouth on victims of heart attacks and push their chests, CPR, but he did not know how to do it, and in any case could not do it with the pilot who is sitting up in the seat and still trapped in with his seatbelt. So he touched the pilot with the tips of his fingers, touched him on the chest, and could do nothing, feel nothing, no heartbeat, no rise and fall of breathing, which meant that the pilot was almost certainly dead. Please, Brian said, but did not know what or who to ask. Please. The plane lurched again, hit more turbulence, and Brian felt the nose drop. So the nose is the front of a plane. Brian is alone in the plane right now. The pilot is dead, and the plane's hitting turbulence. It did not dive, but the nose went down slightly, and the down angle increased the speed, and he knew that at this angle, this slight angle down, he would ultimately fly into the trees. He could see them ahead on the horizon, where before he could see only sky. He had to fly it somehow, had to fly the plane. He had to help himself. The pilot was gone, beyond anything he could do. He had to try and fly the plane. He turned back in the seat, feeling the front, and put his hands, still trembling, on the control wheel, his feet gently on the rubber pedals. You pulled back on the stick to raise the plane. He knew that from reading. You always pulled back on the wheel. He gave it a tug, and it slid back toward him easily. Too easily. The plane, with the increased speed from the tilt down, swooped eagerly up and drove Brian's stomach down. He pushed the wheel back in, went too far this time, and the plane's nose went below the horizon, and the engine speed increased with the shallow dive, so the plane is now diving south. Too much. All right, he pulled back again, more gently this time, and the nose, again the front of the plane, floated up again. Too far, but not as violently as before. Then down a bit too much, then up again very easily, and the front of the engine cowling settled. When he had it aimed at the horizon and it seemed to be steady, he held the wheel where it was, let out his breath, which he had been holding all this time, and tried to think what to do next. It was clear blue sky day with fluffy bits of clouds here and there, and he looked out the window for a moment, hoping to see something, a town or village, but there was nothing. Just the green of the trees, endless green, and lakes scattered more and more thickly as the plane flew. Where? He was flying, but did not know where, had no idea where he was going. So also pause right here just to make this clear. He was on his way to visit his dad because he's going to spend his summers with his dad since his parents are divorced. But what Gary Paulson is telling us here is that when you're up in the sky, if you're not a pilot, it's really hard to tell where you're going. You have no idea where you are. So he doesn't know how to get the plane to where it has to be. He barely knows how to fly it. Let's keep reading. He looked at the dashboard of the plane, studied the dials and hoped to get some help, hoped to find a compass, but it was all so confusing. A jumble of numbers and lights. One lighted display in the top center of the dashboard said number 32. A number next to it said 22. Down beneath that were dials with lines that seemed to indicate what the wings were doing, tipping or moving, and one dial with a needle pointing to the number 70. So actually, we're going to pause right here. Basically, all this stuff in these two paragraphs, I'm going to skip real quick, is Gary Paulson explaining to us, wow, flying a plane is really confusing. There's all these numbers and dials and meters. He doesn't know what they mean and does not know how to fly this plane. Let's go right here. But the radio. Of course, he had to use the radio. When the pilot had been hit that way, he couldn't bring himself to say the pilot was dead. Couldn't really think it. He had been trying to use the radio. Brian looked to the pilot. The headset was still on his head, turned sideways a bit from his jamming back into the seat, and the microphone switch was clipped to his belt. Brian had to get the headset off the pilot, had to reach over and get the headset from the pilot, or he would not be able to use the radio to call for help. He had to reach over. His hands began trembling. He did not want to touch the pilot, did not want to reach for him, but he had to get the radio. He lifted his hands from the wheel just slightly and held them, waiting to see what would happen. The plane flew on normally, smoothly. All right, he thought, now to do this thing. He turned and reached for the headset, slid it from the pilot's head, one eye on the plane, waiting for it to dive. The headset came easily, but the microphone switch at the pilot's belt was jammed in, and he had to pull it to get loose. When he pulled, his elbow bumped the wheel and pushed it in, and the plane started in a shallow dive. Brian grabbed the wheel and pulled it back too hard again, and the plane went through another series of stomach-wrenching swoops up and down before he could get it under control. When things had settled again, he pulled at the mic cord once more, and at last jerked the cord free. It took him another second or two to place the headset on his own head and position the small microphone tube in front of his mouth. He had seen the pilot use it, had seen him depress the switch at his belt, so Brian pushed the switch in and blew into the mic. He heard the sound of his breath in the headset. Hello? Is there anybody listening on this? Hello? He repeated it 2 or 3 times and then waited but heard nothing except his own breathing. Panic came then. He had been afraid, had been stopped with the terror of what was happening, but now panic came, and he began to scream into the microphone, scream over and over, help, somebody help me, I'm in this plane and don't know. Again, there's that repetition. I read that and I think, wow, Gary Paulson put don't know 3 times in a row to show us that Brian really doesn't know what he's doing. That stresses the importance of how clueless and hopeless he must feel. Up in the sky, don't know how to fly a plane, but stuck doing it alone. And he started crying with the screams, crying and slamming his head against the wheel of the plane, causing it to jerk down, then back up. But again, he heard nothing but the sound of his own sobs and dying microphone, his own screams mocking him coming back into his ears. The microphone. Awareness cut into him. He had used his CB radio in his uncle's pickup once. You had to turn the mic switch off to hear anybody else. He reached into his belt and released the die switch. For a second, all he heard was the whoosh of the empty airwaves. Then through the noise and static, he heard a voice. Whoever is calling on this radio net, I repeat, release your mic switch. You are covering me. You are covering me. Over. It stopped and Brian hit his mic switch. I hear you. This is me. He released the switch. Roger, I have you now. His voice was very faint and breaking up. Please state your difficulty and location, and say over to signal end of transmission. Over. Please state my difficulty, Brian thought. God, my difficulty. I am in a plane with a pilot who has had a heart attack or something. He can't fly, and I don't know how to fly. Help me. Help. Again, that repetition. He really needs help. He turned his mic off without ending transmission properly. There was a moment's hesitation before the answer. Tor signal is breaking up, and I lost most of it. Understand, pilot, you can't fly, correct? Over. So right now, pause. I want you to make sure that you're filling in your graphic organizer as you go. Add as much as you can, and then go to the read aloud link, the second one that I have on the website.